Let's see if I can figure out how this works. Okay, well that's showing me, which is not particularly as intended. I think we've got it there. We go, maybe. Okay. Let's just close that. All right. Okay. Yeah, probably should have been a wee bit more prepared, but my understanding of live streaming is incredibly limited. I believe we're working now. Yeah, I'm just going to presume that that's working. So let's listen back to it, stream for a bit. Can you guys hear me? Yeah, okay, so that's working. Hello. So stream starts now, precisely, at 1:01 p.m. So first things first, what we're going to do, we're going to be going through the biological levels of analysis. That is, if we get my beautiful spreadsheets up, that is all of the outcomes here. So the principles of the biological level, the research at the biological level, ethics, and the rest of these ones here. We're going to go over the studies that I personally recommend using for this biological level of analysis, and then we're going to be going over how I recommend structuring answers. And don't forget to check out Mango's and FCL's streams for the socio-cultural and cognitive aspects. Of course, I don't really have the time to cover them all in one video. Okay, and if anyone's wondering, yes, I will make all of my notes available at the end of the video should I actually figure out how to do so. So first things first, we're going to be looking at Bouchard, Heston, Caspi, HM, Clive Wearing, Maguire, Newcomer, Baumgartner, Roger and Kesner, Rain, Meany, Rosenwig, Bennett, Fernald, Curtis, Vesler, Rosen, and Rose. If you want a full list of those, I will put them in the Discord. You can get them at any time. I guess we just get started. So the first study is Bouchard et al., also known as the Minnesota Twins study. This study was conducted on monozygotic and dizygotic twins, with monozygotic twins being twins that share the exact same DNA and genetics, which basically identical twins, and dizygotic being non-identical twins, so they have different DNA. It also looked at siblings. Now, it looked at monozygotic twins raised by themselves, with each other and individually. So these are monozygotic twins that had been adopted to two different families. What the study did was it conducted an intelligence or IQ test upon participants using a method of psychometric testing. All of the participants were given interviews and testing, and they were tested at least twice. There was also a control taken of regular people that were just compared to themselves. So these weren't participants in the twin study. These were just people that were tested psychologically. The results of the control were 87% correlation. So if the same person set the series of IQ tests and interviews twice, their scores would correlate 87% of the time. Monozygotic twins that were raised in the same household correlated 86% of the time. The difference between the same person being tested twice and the monozygotic twins can be put down to chance due to the limited size of the sample. So it can be determined that monozygotic twins raised together generally have the same intelligence as the same person So two people have the same intelligence if they're monozygotic raised together. Then there was monozygotic raised apart, which saw a 10% decrease in correlation rate, showing that, although still pertaining a 76% correlation rate, showing that genetics plays a significant role in the in intelligence. Then there were dizygotic twins that were raised together. They had a concordance rate of 50%, and siblings had one of about 45%, though I don't have it written here for some reason. What this led Bouchard to conclude is that genetics plays 70% of the role in the development of intelligence, whereas environment plays 30%. This is assuming that dizygotic and monozygotic twins had similar experiences. So they're presuming that people that were raised together had similar childhoods. So they're presuming that if you lived in the same household, there was no significant differences, which is a bit of a limited assumption, as we don't know if they had perhaps musical hobbies or something such as that that separated them, but generally it's a safe assumption to make. It's worth noting that each participant received 50 hours of testing, so it was very, very, very thorough. And this study was cross-cultural, so it had Europeans, Americans, and some Asians in the test, with some African Americans as well. No cause and effect can be determined. The next study that we're looking at is Heston. Heston is a study that looks at the genetic inheritance of schizophrenia. So if you didn't notice, we're going through genetic studies first. So this study looked at 97 participants, of which were adoptees in the United States. So 50 of the adopted children were deemed as having mothers that had not developed schizophrenia, while as 47 of the children who had been adopted did have mothers that had developed schizophrenia. The children were interviewed, observed, they had their hospital records monitored, and they had interviews conducted with people close to them. So traditionally, I believe we say that they interviewed the school that they attended, although I can't actually find any evidence showing that they actually did that, but it seems to be generally accepted. So what was found is that of the children who had schizophrenic mothers, 10% developed schizophrenia, which is 10 times the national rate of America, which is 1% schizophrenia. They also had a much higher rate of developing personality disorders, higher rate of developing sociopathy, and a lower IQ on average than the other group, with a higher amount of autism. This led them to conclude that there appears to be a correlation between the genetics and history of schizophrenia and the children developing schizophrenia. It's worth noting, though, that the people in this study, the amount of time they spent in the adoption centers was not actually considered. So some people spent 1 or 2 years, while others spent 3 or 4 years, and it's unknown how much that could have affected their development of schizophrenia. Environmental factors were not controlled. Now, this was something brought up by Sullivan, is that Heston may have been biased during the interviews. Now, I can't tell you anything more about that, but it's a valid criticism. However, all interviews were conducted by at least 2 psychologists, meaning that it should be fine. Now, Sullivan et al. Is a good high-level criticism of this. Sullivan et al. Was a study that looked at people who developed schizophrenia, and they looked at the genetics in their brain, and they could not find a single gene mutation that all people with schizophrenia had, although, of course, it's quite obvious that they could have missed one. But it shows that it's definitely, genetics is not proven to be something that affects schizophrenia. There's only a correlation, not a causation. Finally, we got Caspi, which looked at the 5-HTT genes. Now, one thing that annoyed me is that most classes don't actually cover what the 5-HTT gene does. So depression, which is what this study was looking at, is caused by the brain constantly appraising information in a negative sense. So appraising the situations around it in a negative sense. This appraisal is affected by the levels of serotonin in the brain. So high levels of serotonin means better appraisals and less depression. The 5-HTT gene is the gene which is responsible for the transportation of serotonin throughout the brain. So, presumably, mutations in this gene lead to limited or malfunctioning transportation of serotonin in the brain, which would in turn lead to depression. This is information that came out after Casper conducted his study, so that's just like a good criticism put on the end, and it's also good if you're asked to talk about genetics, you can go into a bit more detail about what the individual gene actually does. Now, this method, Casper et al. Was a study that was conducted on New Zealanders, all of European descent, and they had their alleles measured. These are the lengths of the alleles of the 5-HTT genes. They were then divided into 3 groups. The first group had one long allele and one short allele. The second group had 2 long alleles, and the third group had 2 short alleles. Now, what this meant, what they did was they they interviewed the people in the sample, they interviewed their friends and family, they interviewed their working colleagues, and they interviewed their neighbors. And they used that to create a map of the number of depressive stresses which the person had experienced within the last 4 years. So all the participants were the age of 25, and they tried to find all the stresses that they had experienced in the last 4 years, so from 21 to 25. They then compared the amount of people that were depressed to the number of these stresses. And what was found is that participants who had 2 short alleles had a higher rate of depression when they'd experienced 3 or more psychological stresses, so depressive stresses, within the last 4 years. Whereas participants who'd only experienced 1 or 2 stresses saw no major differences whether they had short alleles or long alleles. What this means is that the decreased transportation of serotonin, which is caused by the shortened 5-HTT gene, only is really important when a person has experienced multiple severe depressive factors and not when they just received 1 individual or 2 stressor factors. It's interesting, of course, the participants with the long alleles actually were more likely to be stressed after 1 or 2 stresses than the other groups, but that's just put down to chance. So yeah, say that, then mention the serotonin hypothesis, which I was going over earlier. This proved a correlation, not causal relationship. It is supported by the diathesis stress model. However, it is very reductionist. Okay, now we're moving on to the studies relating to the function of memory in the brain. The first of which is HM, which I'm sure you've all gone over 20 gazillion times, so we're just going to go through it lickety-split. So there was a child, he suffered from epilepsy. At the age of 16, the condition became too severe for him to go on living, so he underwent surgery that was conducted by Scoville, removed his hippocampus. Cured epilepsy but caused him to suffer from severe anterograde and minor retrograde amnesia. Meaning unable to recall memories or that were recent, or unable to form new memory. He was put into a medical care facility where he was observed, interviewed, and tested. During the observations and interviews, they determined that his declarative episodic memory was not creating new memories. However, his procedural memory was still developing, as seen by the fact that he was able to complete trace stars. So he was able to trace a star between 2 stars when looking into the mirror. An MRI machine scanned his brain, found that the hippocampus was missing, proving the initial theory. It supports localization plasticity theory and shows that the hippocampus plays a role in the encoding and possibly retrieval of memory. More encoding than retrieval, though, of course, he was still able to retrieve a lot of his old memories. Clive Wearing is a study which I don't personally use, so we're going to cover very briefly. He suffered from encephalitis, which destroyed his hippocampus, causing him to suffer from both anterograde and retrograde. Now, initially, we thought it was only the hippocampus that was damaged, but later studies found out that he also had damage to his frontal cortex and a little bit of damage to his Broca's area, but that's he didn't have problems speaking, so I don't really know what that came into. Anyway, his semantic memory was completely stuffed up. He was unable to tell the difference between things like jam and marmalade. His procedural memories were kind of okay. He was able to learn like routes, like where to walk to get to places, but that took a long time and was still not great. He was also able to play music, showing his procedural memory is intact. He was able to remember his wife, though not much else, potentially showing emotional memory as separate. So yeah, that's basically all I really care about this. I just use it to say blah, blah, blah supports HM. Maguire, actually the first study I ever covered, Maguire was a study conducted on 16 right-handed male London taxi drivers who'd been active for at least 2 years. We can presume that because they were a London taxi driver, they had a good understanding of spatial memory, and their spatial memory was quite developed due to the fact that they were working in a very networked and very complex city for the time of GPSs. They had their brains scanned using an MRI machine, and they had their results compared to a sample of 50 normal, age-matched, right-handed males, and it was found that through the use of pixel counting and computer analysis, they had more matter in their anterior hippocampus and less matter in their posterior hippocampus compared to the control sample, showing that grey matter in anterior hippocampus is likely linked to spatial memory. It was also the amount of spatial memory was proportional to the amount of time they'd been working as a taxi driver. So the next study is Newcomer et al. Now moving on to cortisol, which is a... that's not good. My brain is having a wee bit of a... yeah, it's a neurotransmitter. No, what am I saying? Not a neurotransmitter, it's a hormone. Ugh. So, definition of a hormone is something produced by the endocrine system. That's really all the definition that there is. So, and it travels through the blood and is absorbed throughout the brain or the body, causing emotional and physiological change, yada, yada, yada. But the key word is created by the endocrine system, because everything else is iffy. Of course, a lot of hormones don't behave the same way as others. We'll get on to that when we get on to oxytocin up here. So Newcomer wanted to determine the effect of stress upon declarative and verbal memory, and in turn the effect of cortisol on declarative verbal memory. So participants were divided into 3 groups through double-blind procedures, meaning that neither the patients nor the researchers knew what they were getting. And the patients received either 160 milligram, a 40 milligram, or a placebo tablet of cortisol. Now, it's worth noting that 160 milligrams of cortisol is beyond the scope of normal life, so it's very unlikely a person to have that level of cortisol in their system. So it's a very unrealistic sample. But generally, it stimulates extreme high levels of stress. 40 is low levels. They received these tablets daily, so they weren't just one tablet over a week-long period, in which they continued to perform verbal declarative memory tests during that time. Now, the results of this were that the higher the level of cortisol, the worse the performance over time in the tests. So interestingly, for the first couple of days, the 160 milligram group and 40 milligram group performed about the same. But towards the end of the week, they begin to separate. So what this determined was there's a cause and effect relationship between cortisol levels and verbal declarative memory, but a low ecological validity one because of the fact that it was in a laboratory with stimulated stress sensors, and it was also an unrealistic amount of cortisol. Baumgartner. Now, oxytocin is personally my favorite hormone. I'm going to be using it by hell or high water when I get into that exam. Of course, oxytocin is very interesting. Now, this is not something you've probably covered before, but oxytocin actually functions quite similarly to serotonin, in that it affects the ability for us to make appraisal of situations. So the current theory states that oxytocin plays a role in the appraisal of social cues. So this is things like me talking in a calm voice versus an aggressive voice. You'd have a more hostile response if you're on oxytocin to my aggressive voice, and a less hostile response to my soft voice compared to normal levels. What this means is that it's not actually responsible for the trust emotion, rather it's only responsible for making us be more have a more sensitive response to social cues. So this is actually shown in Baumgartner with the computer test. So Baumgartner aimed to test the effect of the hormone oxytocin upon trust. It's a hormone that's released by the endocrine system. Don't let anyone tell you it's a neurotransmitter. The test had two groups, so there was the control and the oxytocin group. They both received a nasal spray just to make sure that that didn't affect them. But the oxytocin group received an extreme level of oxytocin through the nasal spray. So this is more than anyone would ever experience in their life. Now, they were then asked to perform a trust game where they were given 10 or 20 bucks and told if they gave that money to another person, the other person would receive 3 times that amount and have the option of sharing it with the person giving the money. Sorry. And the rate of trust, this was repeated many times, and the rate at which they continued to give money was recorded. There was also a second group which performed the same game except with a computer, and they were told that the computer would just give it to them 50-50. So half the time they would give them the money, half the time they wouldn't. So if you're a mathematician now, you realize that it's logical to always give the computer your money because you have a possibility of return that's 3 times. But anyway, the results of the study were that people were in the people-to-people conditions. The people who received oxytocin were more likely to continue trusting after being betrayed, while those who had not received oxytocin stopped trusting people quite early on. In the computer condition, interestingly, and this goes back to what we were mentioning earlier, there was no difference between the groups. I mean, no real difference. Like, there was minor differences that was put down due to chance. So what this indicates is that oxytocin is not actually responsible for the emotion of trust, but as I mentioned, social cues. So good evaluative point. Then yeah, that's really all there is here. Love oxytocin. Now we're on to Roger and Kesner et al. That's a fun one. Now you see, Roger and Kesner, this is what Martinez and Kesner is meant to be. So Martinez and Kesner is actually the name of a book that talked about Roger and Kesner. And the AP system and the IB system just mistake the two and begin calling them Martinez and Kesner instead of Roger and Kesner. And this was only picked up actually last year. So the 2018 kids are fine. You can use Martinez and Kesner or Roger and Kesner. But 2019 onwards, you have to say Roger and Kesner because Martinez and Kesner is a book, not a study. Anyway, this study wanted to look at acetylcholine, pardon the spelling, I don't really care, the effect it had on spatial memory. To do this, there was 3 groups. One is the scopolamine group. What this did was it blocked the receptor sites on the receiving end of the neuron, and it increased the ACH reuptake on the emitting side, meaning more was reabsorbed by the neuron than admitted. The phytostigmine group had their ACH receptors cleared by a chemical produced by the phytostigmine, meaning they had more ACH successfully being neurally transmitted. And then there was just a control group. So the first thing that happened before they received these dosages was they were run through a maze. So just a two-option maze. They were run through it 5 times. They were then given the injection of the drug, at which point they were run through the maze 5 times again. Now, the important thing here is that this is differentiating between memory retrieval and memory encoding, because all rodents had been given the opportunity to encode the memory prior to going into the maze. So what happened was that the ACH group, so the high ACH group, made less mistakes in the later, made less mistakes in the later trials, but they didn't necessarily make as many. They made about the same mistakes in the earlier trials. So that shows that ACH might have an effect upon encoding, so negatively affect encoding, but positively affect retrieval. Whereas the other groups performed about the same, suggesting that that there's a problem with their retrieval with the low levels of ACH rather than a problem with their encoding. Yeah, so low group had no trouble encoding, but more trouble retrieving. So we know that because they were consistent across all of the challenges. So like, yeah, it's difficult to generalize. I don't particularly like Roger and Kesner because it's not a well-taught study, and it's one of those ones where people have mistaken Martinez and Kesner and Roger and Kesner so much that the details get a little bit blurry. Of course, the details of Martinez and Kesner are just made up, basically, which is great. Absolutely great. Now there's Rain et al. Rain et al. Should have been up here with Maguire, but it's not. This study is looking at localization of function in the amygdala. Now, Rain et al. Was a study that was conducted on how many? I believe it was 40 nigiris, of which 2 were women, so less than 5% women in the study is really all you need to say there. And these are people that had murdered someone or had committed a severe crime and had been found not guilty by reason of insanity. Then there was a control group of people that had no mental disorders. Now, all of the people in this were screened for schizophrenia prior to going into the test, as well as some other minor mental illnesses, so that's hopefully being eliminated. But they haven't eliminated things such as depression and the drug consumption of the inmates was also not considered. So what they did was they put them into a positron emission tomography scanner where they were asked to perform a cognitive processing test. They then had the brain activity found, and it was found that they had lower activity in their limbic system and their amygdala compared to the normal people, showing that perhaps the limbic system is responsible for inhibition, because obviously these people had the lowered inhibition to commit the crime. Worth noting, though, that only Americans in California were tested. I don't particularly like Rain. I'm only using it for the reference to, what was it, brain imaging technology. Moscone should also be there, but I didn't bother writing it in, so we're just gonna copy that in. Yeah. Moscone is more used in cognitive and biological, but it's still useful to know, because if you're using Rain, it's good to add to the positron emission technology. So what this one says, just move it up to Rain. Positron emit, it shows, it looks at positron emission technology in regards to Alzheimer's. So people over a 24-year period underwent regular positron emission scans to determine differing activity in their brain. And it was found that people who had a higher metabolic in the hippocampus had a higher risk of developing Alzheimer's. Next, we got Meany. Now, we're almost done with this part, so hopefully my 1-hour goal will be met. Meany was a study that looked at the effects of human contact and no human contact, which is also looking at cortisol levels, on spatial memory and brain density. So rats were at birth divided into 2 groups, so they were taken immediately away from their mother and put into isolated cages. One group of the rodents was forcefully stroked by the researchers for 15 minutes a day, and bonus points if any of you that can sexualize that in your exams. And the unnurtured group received no human contact. So 15 minutes of contact versus no human contact at all. And after varying periods of time, with the longest period being 3 years that, so they were stroked 15 minutes a day for 3 years, they were placed into a milky bath of water with a small platform. Now, previous studies have shown that rodents will attempt to get out of water as soon as they've been placed into it. So the rodents would presumably rush towards the platform that was in there. Now, it was recorded that the rodents that had been stroked for longer periods of time, so those that had been stroked for, say, 1 or 2 years instead of a few weeks, had a higher performance in the pool, so they would reach the platform faster than the rodents that had not been stroked at all. They also found that they would secrete less glucocorticoids, and upon completion of the test, they were dissected, and it was found that they had larger hippocampi. Just generally, the only criticism you need to put in with meanie is that it's not really applicable to humans, because the circumstances are really extreme and rats themselves aren't necessarily relatable to humans. Now we go to Rosenwig and Bennett. Now, Rosenwig and Bennett is one of those studies which is often taught incorrectly, so it's really important that you actually read through this and understand what happened. So they used Berkeley rats, and they were injected with a saline or methamphetamine solution. They were then placed into one of 2 cages. There was an isolated cage in which the rats were kept individually, and then there was a home cage where the rats were allowed to socialize with each other. Now, then we break into further. So all of the rats were then divided into an additional 2 groups, one of which received no enrichments, and the other of which did receive enrichment, so that was playing with toys, and they were allowed to play with toys for 2 hours per day. And then this was divided even further into the fact that the rats that were allowed to play with toys were either allowed to play with toys during light or during darkness. So this is so that's something that's not often gone into, but it's important to realize. Now, the interesting results of this study are, one, the rats that were isolated and the rats that were kept in a social group had the same amount of brain development as long as they were in the enriched condition. So it didn't matter if a rat was allowed to socialize or not, as long as they were enriched, they had the same development of the hippocampus and the cortexes. Another interesting fact, and this is something that they probably don't need to remember, but I'm going to put it in there just for bonus points, is that the methamphetamine solution rats performed better when the light was off compared to the rats that had the saline injection. So when they were playing in the enriched condition in the dark, they had greater brain growth than the ones that were playing in the light, and the saline solution ones that were playing in the dark. So what's this show? This shows that enriched conditions allow for a better development of the cortex and the brain, whereas deprived conditions cause a smaller development, shows brain plasticity. It also shows that socialization is not necessary for a condition to be considered enriched in the case of rodents. Now we move on to Furnout and Gunner. Furnout and Gunner is a quasi-experiment that also looked at enriched versus deprived conditions. It took saliva samples of Mexican children between the ages of 2 and 6. Now, all children in this study were considered to have been from a deprived environment, so they are from the poor parts of Mexico, with one group receiving economic aid while another group not receiving economic aid. So the one receiving economic aid was considered to be in a better environment than the other group. So the children received a saliva test, and they also received some minor interviews, but they weren't really tested, really considered. And what it was found was that the children in the highest socioeconomic class had lower levels of cortisol in their saliva if their mother was suffering from major depression. If the children's mother did not suffer from major depression, both groups actually performed about the same, which means that increased enriched environment does not actually improve one's stress levels. It adds additional factors that prevent them from lowering. Now, the key criticism to be gathered in this study is that cortisol response comes from when you experience a stress or a new environment. So in this study, a bunch of researchers just walked into this Mexican town and started testing the children. This would be very, very surprising for people that lived in the lowest socioeconomic classes. So these are the people that never seen a city, never seen a car, whereas the people who were receiving aid were presumably more used to seeing foreigners and had a bit of a better life. So it is possible that the people had a lower cortisol level in their saliva simply because they were less surprised by seeing the researchers. I mean, that's basically all the criticism you'll get. Again, I'll upload all this at the end of the study. Next is Curtis. I don't like Curtis, but let's go through it anyway, because there's not much on disgust. So Curtis proposes the idea that disgust is a response which we have for when our immune system is not capable of dealing with a threat. And he proposed a study to show this, in which 40,000 people, originally 72,000 people, but 32,000 were removed from the study because of reasons, which is a little concerning. You know, he could have just eliminated all the people that disagreed with his views, but you know. And they were shown a series of pictures and asked them to rate them on a level of 1 to 5, depending on how disgusting they thought they were. Now, what they would do is women would be always more disgusted than men in regards to these photos. But the interesting fact is that younger people were also more disgusted than older people. And they were more likely to be disgusted by things such as bodily fluid or diseased items than by things such as photos of bestiality, which are not infectious. It's also worth noting that people were more likely to trust the fluids of a friend than the fluid of a stranger. Now, what this shows is that disgust is an emotion which seems to react more to items that are of a possible biological threat, so diseased items, rather than anything particular. However, it's worth noting that 80% of the participants of the study were European. Most of the participants who took the study were removed by the researchers, and it was self-reported and not necessarily valid. Now, we're just going to skip ahead to Rosen here for a sec here, because Rosen conducted a survey across multiple cultures where he showed them pictures such as eating a cockroach or eating, you know, irky, dirty food. And it was found that in places like Africa and Asia, where this was a more common thing, you know, to eat bugs or things, which is something many cultures do, they were less likely to be disgusted by the images which Europeans were disgusted by, showing that perhaps this is not a biological response to a threat, but rather a sociocultural response that's developed through our society. Next is Fessler, which is our last major study of the day. Now, Fessler proposes, again, that discusses an immune response and is designed to improve the immune system. Now, what's important to realize is that Fessler wasn't actually looking to prove the relationship between pregnancy and disgust. Fessler wanted to prove that a lowered immune system causes increased disgust response. So when you say that the study aimed, you can't say the study aimed to look at pregnant people, it's just that pregnant people had lowered immune responses. So 500 women were in stages of pregnancy, various stages, so first, second, or third trimester, and they were asked to fill out an online survey, which they mostly did. I believe only 24 refused, where they were asked to rate how disgusting they find it, an image on a scale of 1 to 16. These images were randomly picked off of Google. There are things like bestiality, deceased food, diseased water, blue liquid, things like that. Just honestly, you can just make it up because no one really cares. So what it was they were asked to rate an image, and then they'd receive a series of less disgusting questions to try and find out whether or not, to try and prevent them from ruminating on their nausea, so to stop them thinking about the previous images. And the rating was monitored. It was found that women in their first trimester just rated everything higher than women in their second trimester. So no matter what, first trimester women were more disgusted than second and third trimester, particularly in regards to diseased foods and diseased items, where their level of disgust was almost double that of the second and third trimester women. It's interesting noting, because this was something that Fessler picked up, was that in regards to bestiality, there was actually no difference. they both sort of as highly disgusting, which is to be expected, I guess. Limited sample, self-reported, but data is consistent with replications. Now, finally, there's just the Rose's comments here. Now, Rose is actually talking in regard to Fessler, because Fessler made the observation that because these people had an immune disorder in the past, because in the past, people would need this disgust response to prevent them from eating diseased food, they would therefore continue to do that in the present. But Rose said that just because there was previously a need for this disgust doesn't mean that it's currently biological. Alright, that's all of the studies we're going to go through. Now we're going to go through how to use them in each of the learning outcomes. Sorry, I just talked for 40 minutes. So, yeah, this will definitely be an hour presentation, which is good. Now, the learning outcomes, according to my predictions, you will be getting ethical considerations into genetic research for the 22 mark and hormones for the 8 mark, which is why I focus so much on oxytocin, because you use that for there, and we focus so much on genetics. I'd still study for all of them, like I'm personally doing that, but you don't have to. So for GLO 1 and 2, I recommend using the principle that patterns of behavior can be genetically inherited, to which you would respond with either Bouchard, where you talk about how intelligence is genetically inherited, Heston, where you could talk about how schizophrenic is genetically inherited, or Caspi. I personally would talk about Caspi because you can talk a bit more in detail. You can mention the serotonin stuff I said previously, which is quite a high-level thought because it's not in any of the given responses. Then we've got research methods. I recommend doing case studies and experiments. This is because case studies provide rich qualitative data, while experiments provide rich quantitative data, so you can make good comparisons between the two. The important notes to remember is that case studies are always longitudinal and they contain multiple methods of research, so that's observations, interviews, etc. And you'd use H&M, Clive Wearing, and if you wanted to, you could probably... No, just stick with H&M and Clive Wearing. For experiments, Newcomer's good, McGuire's good. You can also add Baumgartner in there, but, you know, I don't really care. Next, we've got ethics. Now, for ethics, we're breaking this down to a few different things. I'm going to be doing informed consent, where we talk about HM. He's unable to give informed consent because of the fact he's unable to form memories. So you can talk about how you needed to seek informed consent from peers and their family. And Newcomer. Now, Newcomer is interesting because the participants in Newcomer didn't actually know that they were receiving a high level of cortisol. So there's a little bit of deception going on there, which is good. You can talk about risk, cost, benefits of participant protection. Use Rosenwig and Bennett for that. There's not much more you can say about that. Now, the interesting stuff for this is going to be in genetics, and we're going to cover that in GV3 in a bit. Brain localization, easy. You won't be getting to the 22 mark. Just doesn't happen. Just talk about HM, talk about Clive Wearing, talk about Rain, or talk about McGuire. Pick whichever one you're best with. Neurotransmission. Now, I previously used to recommend Casamatsu and Hiari for neurotransmission in addition to Roger and Kesner. Casamatsu and Hiari has just been shown to didn't actually occur. So, you know, there's a little bit of, like, I don't feel too comfortable using it, but, like, you could if you needed to. But I just talk about serotonin, so you don't actually need to study for this because you've already included Rosgerez and Kesner for ACH, and then for the other one, just talk about the serotonin hypothesis that I went over earlier. Next, we've got hormones. Hormones are easy. Baumgartner, talk about how it influences one's appraisal of situations. Just as I said, if you haven't seen my previous bits, go watch them. And Newcomer or Meany for cortisol. Remember, Meany is glucocorticoids. Newcomer is cortisol. They're the same thing technically, but the IB makes a differentiation. Enriched and deprived environment. Now we're getting into the things that could come up in your exam, so we're going to go into them in a wee bit more detail. So this condition that we're looking at enriched and deprived environments. Now, one thing you talk about first is enriched environments are environments that have stimulating objects, are educational in regards to humans, and typically have social companionship. That way, when you talk about Rosenwig and Bennett, you can say that the social bits are not as important as previously thought. So this is Maguire and Bennett. Maguire shows how a positive stimulating environment increases brain matter in the anterior hippocampus. And Rosenbig and Bennett shows how the deprived conditions. Don't use these notes. Go back to the ones I did previously because these are really old. This is just the outlines. Effect 2 is the effect of stress on biochemistry. So this is using Meany, so the non-handled rats versus handled rats. And Fernald and Gunner, where we're looking at the level of cortisol on the tongue. Again, all of this will be added later. Don't use KF. KF is dumb. Cognition and physiology is just... I mean, it's basically just localization again, because all you're going to do is talk about memory. You're going to be talking about amnesia, so that's the cognition and how it interacts with the physiology of brain damage. But if you remember the graph I was showing up there, this came up, yeah, last year, so it won't realistically be coming up again this year. But yeah, so anterograde amnesia, retrograde amnesia, Maguire contradicts some of the facts of Clive Wearing. Not too much to go on here, it probably won't come up. Medical imaging, MRIs were used in Maguire, HM, and Clive Wearing, as I mentioned. PET scans were used in Rain and Baumgardner. In Baumgardner, the PET... No, actually, no. Baumgardner used fMRI. That needs to be removed. That should be Mosconi and Rain. So if you're using fMRI, you can insert Baumgardner in there. If not, Mosconi and Rain. So yeah, that's very easy. Now, when you're talking about MRIs, the way MRIs work is that a uniform magnetic field is applied across a patient. Then a gradient magnetic field is applied across them. This causes the protons in their brain to change their spin direction, leading them to emit a radio frequency. This radio frequency is interpreted to create a three-dimensional image of the brain and nervous impulses, which provides full structural data. Positron emission technology, let's see if I've got this written out, because I haven't done positron emission technology in a while. Positron emission technology, so I can say that it works by monitoring the activity of different functions of the brain. So MRI is structural, positron emission technology is activity-based. I don't have any notes on this, so I'll just go over what I know. Oh, here it is. So positron emission technology works by injecting the patient with a glucose-based solution that has low activity and low half-life. The admission of this solution is monitored. Now, depending on the activity of the brain structure, the amount of solution in that area is differing. So depending on the metabolism rate, the amount of the solution differs, and therefore the reading given also differs. Evolutionary behavior. Now, evolutionary behavior came up, well, last time, so I doubt it'll be coming up again, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. But evolutionary behavior, you use Curtis, the Disgust, and Fessler. Talk about these two here, and do a lot of your own speculation. Like, start talking about how you think it would improve survival chances if people were more disgusted to disease things. Talk about how, in times where we were in a fight for survival situation, it was more important that we were capable of more important that we're capable of finding food than finding safe food. So disgust exists to ensure we didn't, eat things that just straight up kill us. Now, there's also the oral origins hypothesis that proposes that humans in the past have an increased risk to foodborne diseases than we currently do. And that was because our diet was more meat-based, meaning this is probably the evolutionary reason for the evolution of disgust. Now we're into the stuff that will probably come up, genetics. So genetics, genes are passed from mothers to fathers. They mutate, they evolve, all of that loveliness. Monozygotic twins have 100% gene share, while dizygotic have 50%. Genes cannot be fully isolated, and we cannot fully determine the genes of an individual person. Now, they relate to depressive tendencies, which is Caspi. Brown and Harris is something I've added there. You don't need it. That's only for people who have done abnormal psych, I think. Then there's intelligence. For intelligence, just use Bouchard. And then schizophrenia. Schizophrenia, use Caspi. Now, ethics. Ethics is the thing that we're all hoping is going to come up. It looks like it will. It was in the sample paper for 2019, so we're all really hoping. The key ethics. So ethics differs between studies. Caspi is a good place to focus because you've got the whole serotonin stuff. And if people were informed they had a problem with their serotonin transportation, they could receive selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors to increase the flow, meaning that the problem could be fixed. However, Caspi decided not to tell people that they were suffering from a condition because he wanted to protect their anonymity. So you can make a whole discussion about how he had to value up the values of anonymity over improving the medical health of participants. Heston, well, that's pretty easy. If everyone knew you were likely to develop schizophrenia or you were likely to be a psychopath, it would be problematic. Sullivan, that was the one which said that we can't actually determine any of the genes, so that's just a Caspi criticism. Bouchard is an interesting one because, like, I mean, I personally don't see too many ethical quandaries here, but we should talk about it because there's the ethical quandary of, one, finding out that your brother exists or your sister exists that you hadn't been told of, which is a bit comedic, and two, knowing the fact that you genetically can't be more intelligent than a certain point because of your IQ, but that's just the same, ethical quandaries of standard IQ testing. Talk about informed consent, and I'd recommend mentioning the Baby Sec project, which is something that originated in New York and is quite popular in China right now, where people are choosing the gender of their child and modifying some other minor genes. So you can talk about the ethical consideration of the studies leading to selective child gene modification. That's everything. That is everything. So unless anyone has any questions or wants me to go over anything again, I'm going to finish up there. Just type in chat. Give me one sec. Freaking nightmare. Alright. So no. Okay then. Well, I guess we've finished a full review of biological. That's covered basically everything. I'm going to upload a Word document with all of the details added in, so that's anything else. It's important. Oh, that was exhilarating. So yeah, I recommend just watching through the studies but a few times, particularly Baumgartner, because I find that really interesting, the whole appraisal part of oxytocin, and make sure you go over Roger and Kesner a few times because that hasn't been taught very well in the past. And yeah, that's everything. So I'm gonna sign off. See yous. Lovely. Okay, I don't actually know how to end this. Does that work? I might have just swapped it back to my... Yeah, I just swapped it back to my face. Well, that's dandy. You get to look at me one last time. See yous. Fix it now, I think.